Welcome to Christianity 125, Lecture 2. We are going to be starting the book of Genesis today. We're spending a lot of time in Genesis. It's so representative of a lot of the literature that is in the Old Testament. During this lecture, which may be in two parts, will be in two parts, we will go all the way through the story of Abraham. And then we'll pick up with the story of Isaac and Jacob and Joseph in the next lecture. So we left off by talking about the overarching picture of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament. And now we're going to go pretty much book by book. And we're going to spend a bunch of time here in Genesis. Just to give you some scholarly background to the book of Genesis. Many scholars have been studying Genesis for years, and one of the most popular theories that helps us sort of understand the composition of Genesis is the documentary hypothesis by Julius Wellhausen. The main idea here is that there are at least four authors, or editors is the better word, editors, who contributed to the formation of the Pentateuch. And as you are reading through Genesis, you can see seams in the text, seams that show that here this editor is speaking, or this author is speaking, and here this editor is at work. And so those seams helped scholars identify four different sources that contributed to the document that is Genesis. So we have the J source, which is the Yahwist, and it is called that because the editor uses the word Yahweh for God. The Elohist, E, this source uses the name Elohim for God. The D source, or Deuteronomist, and this is related to the part of Deuteronomy that was found under Josiah in 621 BCE. And the fourth source, the P source, is the priestly source. So the main point of all this is that Genesis is a composite document, not just made up of various stories written by various people, but also compiled by different editors. And we'll look a little bit at that when we look at the creation story. There are two videos here on Genesis from the Bible Project people, and we're going to watch the first one on primeval history. This is what scholars call Genesis 1 through 11, starting with creation and ending with the Tower of Babel. And so let's go ahead and watch that now.
The book of Genesis. It's the first book of the Bible, and its storyline divides into two main parts. There's chapters 1 through 11, which tell the story of God and the whole world. And then there's chapters 12 through 50, which zoom in and tell the story of God and just one man, Abraham, and then his family. And these two parts are connected by a hinge story at the beginning of chapter 12. And this design, it gives us a clue to how to understand the message of the book as a whole and how it introduces the story of the whole Bible. So the book begins with God taking the disorder and the darkness described in the second sentence of the Bible, and God brings out of it order and beauty and goodness. He makes a world where life can flourish. And God makes these creatures called humans, or Adam in Hebrew. He makes them in his image, which has to do with their role and purpose in God's world. So the humans are made to be reflections of God's character out into the world, and they're appointed as God's representatives to rule his world on his behalf, which in context means to harness all of its potential, to care for it, and make it a place where even more life can flourish. God blesses the humans. It's a key word in this book, and he gives them a garden. It's like a place from which they begin starting to build this new world. Now the key is that the humans have a choice about how they're going to go about building this world, and that's represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Up till now, God has provided and defined what is good and what is not good. But now God is giving the humans the dignity and the freedom of a choice. Are they going to trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves? And the stakes are really high. To rebel against God is to embrace death, because you're turning away from the giver of life himself. This is represented by the tree of life. And so in chapter 3, a mysterious figure, a snake, enters into the story. The snake's given no introduction other than it's a creature that God made. And it becomes clear that it's a creature in rebellion against God, and it wants to lead the humans into rebellion and their death. The snake tells a different story about the tree and the choice. It says that seizing the knowledge of good and evil are not going to bring death, that it's actually the way to life and becoming like God themselves. Now, the irony of this is tragic because we know the humans, they're already like God. They were made to reflect God's image. But instead of trusting God, the humans seize autonomy. They take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and in an instant, the whole story spirals out of control. The first casualty is human relationships. The man and the woman, they suddenly realize how vulnerable they are. Now, they can't even trust each other. And so they make clothes and they hide their bodies from one another. The second casualty is that intimacy between God and the humans is lost. So they go and run and hide from God, and then when God finds them, they start this game of blame shifting about who rebelled first. Now right here the story stops, and there's a series of short poems where God declares to the snake and then to the humans the tragic consequences of their actions. God first tells the snake that despite its apparent victory, it is destined for defeat, to eat dust. God promises that one day a seed, or a descendant, will come from the woman who's going to deliver a lethal strike to the snake's head. Which sounds like great news, but this victory is going to come with a cost, because the snake too will deliver a lethal strike to the descendant's heel as it's being crushed. It's a very mysterious promise of this wounded victor. But in the flow of the story so far, you see this is an act of God's grace. The humans, they've just rebelled, and what does God do? He promises to rescue them. But this doesn't erase the consequences of the human's decision. So God informs them that now every aspect of their life together, at home and out in the field, it's going to be fraught with grief and pain because of the rebellion, all leading to their death. From here, the story then spirals downward. Chapters 3 through 11, they trace the widening ripple effect of the rebellion and of human relationships fracturing at every level. So there's a story about two brothers, Cain and Abel. Cain's so jealous of his brother that he wants to murder him. And God warns him not to give in to the temptation, but he does anyway. He murders him in the field. So Cain then goes on to build a city where violence and oppression reign. And this is all epitomized in the story of Lamech. He's the first man in the Bible to have more than one wife. He's accumulating them like property. And then he goes on to sing a short song about how he's more violent and vengeful than Cain ever was. After this, we get an odd story about the sons of God, which could refer to evil angelic beings, or it could refer to ancient kings who claimed that they descended from the gods. And like Lamech, they acquire as many wives as they wanted, and they produce the Nephilim, these great warriors of old. Whichever view is right, the point is that humans are building kingdoms that fill God's world with violence and even more corruption. In response, we're told that God is broken with grief. Humanity is ruining his good world, and they're ruining each other. And so out of a passion to protect the goodness of his world, he washes it clean of humanity's evil with the great flood. But he protects one blameless human, Noah, and his family, and he commissions him as a new Adam. He repeats the divine blessing and commissions him to go out into the world. And so our hopes are really high, but then Noah fails too, and also in a garden. He goes and he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk out of his mind. And then one of his sons, Ham, does something shameful to his father in the tent. And so here we have our new Adam, naked and ashamed, just like the first. And the downward spiral begins again. It all leads to the foundation of the city of Babylon. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, they come together around this new technology they have, the brick. And they can make cities and towers bigger and faster than anybody's ever done before. And they want to build a new kind of tower that will reach up to the gods, and they will make a great name for themselves. It's an image of human rebellion and arrogance. It's the garden rebellion now writ large. And so God humbles their pride and scatters them. Now this is a diverse group of stories, but you can see they're all exploring the same basic point. God keeps giving humans the chance to do the right thing with his world, and humans keep ruining it. These stories are making a claim that we live in a good world that we have turned bad. all chosen to define good and evil for ourselves, and so we all contribute to this world of broken relationships, leading to conflict, violence, and ultimately death. But there's hope. God promised that one day a descendant would come, the wounded victor who will defeat evil at its source. And so despite humanity's evil, God is determined to bless and rescue his world. And so the big question, of course, is what is God going to do? And the next story, The Hinge, offers the answer. But for now, that's what Genesis 1 through 11 is all about.
Okay, so here you see a literary overview of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And it's important as we go through Genesis to note that there is a story that starts here that is really the story of God and humanity. God created a good world and gave human beings free will to live in it, and with their free will, the humans chose to disobey God, to not trust God, to turn away from God, and then suffering and pain entered the world. And that is what we're going to be talking about as we move through the first part of Genesis. Just to give you some background, we want to talk about some of the purposes of Genesis as a literary document, as an account for the people of God, and also some themes. So in Genesis, the purpose is, one, is to recount the origin of the universe, the physical world, and human life. So you see sort of a huge bird's eye view of humanity and the universe. But then it also focuses in on humans as a part of this creation, and it wants to present God as creator, and not just as a creator who made humanity and walked away, but that God loved humanity and continues to interact with humans. Genesis 1 through 11 especially also wants to present the problem of sin and how disobedience, how people choosing to go their own way affects the world and themselves. And then later on in Genesis, we'll see that Genesis also introduces and shows God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants as a way to heal that broken world that happened from the fall in the garden. So then the themes that our textbook discusses are that Genesis, especially Genesis 1 through 11, talks about creation, then talks about the uncreation that happens in the flood, which we will get to, and then the recreation post-flood. So keep those three themes in mind as we move forward. So creation is the first and maybe even the most famous story from Genesis. But many of us don't realize that there are two creation stories found in Genesis. What I want you all to do is to pause the video to complete the following assignment. I want you to read Genesis 1:1 through 2:4a, the first part of 4, and list the order of creation. Basically, what did God create on each day? So day 1, day 2, day 3. And then note in your Bible what is the name that is used for God in this story, Genesis 1:1 through 2:4. Please use the Bible that is for this, the textbook that is for this course. That's the NRSV version of the Bible. And then after that, I want you to read Genesis 2:4b, so that second part of 2:4, and all the way to 2:25. This is actually a second account of creation. If you're not paying attention, you may not see that there is a seam there, that things start changing. The name for God changes, and the story sort of starts over again. So I want you to read that second part as well. List the order of creation here, maybe a little more difficult than the first time, and then note the name that is used for God. After reading both of those accounts and listing those things, will you answer the question, please, what does each account teach us about God and about humanity? There will be some different ideas about God and humanity in these two different accounts. We are actually approaching the end of the video, so you don't have to pause it. It will just stop, and then we'll start back up with the next video.